Welcome to another DCS tutorial, and this time we're going to be looking at short and vertical takeoffs in the Harrier. As carrier landings are probably the most important, we'll start there and then we'll look at short takeoffs, including the various parameters which need to be set, and then we're looking at landings in crosswinds and finally short landings. Okay, we're on board, and the first thing we need to do is to find the carrier. In the mission editor, we set it to TACAN channel 22X. So let's set that up by pressing TCN on the upfront control and then entering 22 and then pressing enter. Then we just have to press TCN on the MFD, which is OSB 5. The HUD is now showing 48 DME, which is the distance to the carrier, and all waypoint cues are also pointing to the carrier. So we now need to contact ATC and tell them that we're inbound, and they will give us the local QFE, and we need to set our barometric altimeter based on that. This is especially important if doing a vertical landing where an airfield is well above sea level. Next, we need to check our weights, and to do that we need to go to the VRES page by pressing OSB 18 to bring up the main menu, then selecting the VRES page on OSB 8, and finally vertical landing on OSB 6. This is showing that we can land with 3,800 pounds of fuel wet and 2,600 dry. We currently have 3,700 pounds of fuel, so could land with water, but if overweight you would need to dump fuel. To do that, set your bingo fuel to whatever you require and open the dump valves. This will dump the fuel and automatically stop dumping at your bingo level, or 2,700 pounds, whichever is the greater. But I prefer to land without needing water, as you only have 90 seconds worth, which is ample if you land first time, but if things go wrong or you need to go around, it can soon run out. And if you do run out of water when maxed out, so to avoid a visit from the Ghanaian funeral troupe, do make sure that you're not at the edge of your limits. Once you arrive at the carrier, don't feel obliged to follow a case one pattern, but it does actually make life easier even if you don't follow the pattern exactly. If you just fly straight in from behind, you are more than likely to overshoot or slow down far too soon, whereas if you generally follow a case one approach, it consistently gets you roughly at the right place and at the right speed. Ideally, you should pass the carrier on its port side at around 300 knots and 800 feet, and about a mile past we're going to start a 180-degree turn. Okay, so let's start the turn, and we're going to pull around 2 to 3 Gs and begin to slow down to under 250 knots. And we're also going to start a gradual descent down to 600 feet. As we pass under 250 knots, we're going to drop our gear and extend our flaps. On the downwind leg, you should be around 600 feet, and you can now change to VSTOL master mode. Take a quick look at the boat, and we should be looking to start our final turn just after we pass the stern. This is going to be a nice gentle turn, starting around 200 knots at 20 degrees bank angle, and we'll add 50 to 60 degrees of vectoring. This will start to slow us down to around 100 knots, and we should gently descend to around 300 feet as we exit the turn. By now you're probably pulling back on the stick to maintain pitch, so you need to trim that out as soon as you can. You also need to be constantly checking your flight path marker and keeping it within the HUD. Depending on your speed, you would likely to be dropping at around 800 feet per minute, and as speed and lift drop, this will quickly spiral out of control and soon become unrecoverable. We're now lined up about 1 mile from the ship. You should try to get your witch's hat on the horizon and trim out. You should try and keep your flight path marker ahead of the ship, which will probably be a 1 to 2 degree descent. As we get to around half a mile, we're going to pull the nozzles back to 82 degrees and slow us to a hover. And the key from now on is to be very gentle with the controls, and especially the throttle, and always keep on top of your trim. You should be aiming to approach about half a carrier width to the port side, and the carrier should ideally be facing directly into the wind with 32 knots of wind across the deck, but that might not always be the case. You can control your speed using pitch, of course, but I try and leave the stick alone as much as possible and use very minor adjustments to the vectoring to alter my speed and to bring us to a final stop. This should be around 120 feet, but no lower than 100 feet, and ideally adjacent to the primary landing position, which is adjacent to the port side lift. Once you're aligned, then take a moment to make sure that everything is settled, and once you're ready to cross over the deck, most people will roll the wings slightly to nudge across bit by bit. But as anyone new to the Harrier will know, it's easy to get into oscillations, so you need to be very gentle. Or you can try applying a little bit of rudder, which will point your nose towards the deck, and as you are actually flying forward at 30 knots, you will gently slide into position. Hopefully you can tell that I'm using the rudder here, and as you can see it's all very stable with no hacking at the controls, which is often the case when you're using the stick. Once over the line, then straighten up and then descend down gently to the deck. And we're down. Half length forward maybe, but not bad. All we need to do now is put it in reverse and park up. Okay, that's the landings done, so let's now take a look at carrier takeoffs. I'm loaded up with 6 cluster bombs, 6 laser JDAMs, a gun pod and targeting pod, and I'm fully fueled, which is just about the heaviest possible combat load for the Harrier. On board from a hot start, the first thing we're going to do is to check out the VRES page, but this time we're going to look at the STO subpage. Each row here has 2 entries, one for wet and one for dry, and that refers to if you're using water injection and not whether it's raining. NRAS is the nozzle rotation airspeed. So that's the speed you need to attain before you pull your nozzles back to the desired angle. and nos is the angle that you pull your nozzles back to. G-roll is the amount of runway needed to take off, and as you can see at present it's showing over 1200 meters and we only have 800 meters of runway, but this will change once we enter the wind conditions. DT50 is the distance to 50 feet. In other words, the distance you would need if someone were to put a 50-foot tall obstacle at the end of the runway. Next is the abort speed. Once beyond this speed, you should commit to taking off as you will likely have insufficient runway to stop. This is hidden by default but can be viewed by pressing the abort button. And this will also reveal SDST, which is the stopping distance from the abort speed. OATC is the outside air temperature in Celsius, and ALTM is the altimeter in inches of mercury. This should be set to your initial runway, but if taking off and landing from elsewhere, especially altitude, then you would need to set this using the barometric altimeter after you contact ATC, who will provide you with the QFE. FLV is the field elevation and again is auto-populated to your initial takeoff location. But you would need to set this if taking off or landing elsewhere, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. GWT is of course gross weight. Run W is runway heading and distance, and you will need to enter this manually, which we'll come to again in a second. Finally, G-wind is the ground wind speed and direction, which is the most important setting we need. And this will also need to be entered manually in knots. Now you should note that the ATC normally reads in meters per second. The conversion though is about 2 to 1, with 10 knots being a fraction over 5 meters per second. However, during air ops, the carrier should sail straight into the wind and aim for 32 knots. So let's enter those bits of data we mentioned into the ODU. We don't need to adjust our field elevation here as this is our start location. So let's go straight to flight data. R dry is for wet or dry runways, and this isn't modelled in DCS. So let's start with R dist, and the length of the tower is 800 meters. So let's hit that and enter. Runway heading in this case is the ship's direction, so that's 072. And finally ground wind. Here the wind is coming from 072 at 17 knots and we're sailing straight into it at 15 knots. So we'll enter 072 over 032. With all that entered, we can now see that we can safely take off at 788 meters or 650 meters with water. And in each case we'll need 50 degrees of vector. I'm now going to start up the engines, so I'll see you on the runway.
This engine's been modified by our mechanical genius here, Moriarty, right?
Whatever you say, babe.
These tanks are faster than any other tanks in the European theater of operations, forwards or backwards. See, man, we like to feel that we can get out of trouble quicker than we got into it.
If you need to go right back to 800 meters, then you should line up your upfront control with the last of the deck lights. Any further back and your left wing will fall off the deck. Let's now do our final checks. So check our flaps. We need 50 degrees of nozzles, so we're going to set our STO stop to 50. so we can pull right back on the nozzle handle without having to worry about getting it perfect. Check the water is set to take off if required, but I'm going to go dry just to show how accurate the calculations are and that we can still carry a full payload. Nozzle rotation speed is 122 knots. All looks good, so brakes on, nozzles aft, and apply full throttle. And as soon as we start to move, then release the brakes. As we hit our NRAS, just pull right back on the nozzles and away we go. Positive climb, and we're away.
15 seconds.
We've already mentioned about setting your barometric altimeter when landing at high altitude. So we're going to take a quick look at just how big an impact it has, and then we're going to land in a moderate wind. We currently have 1100 pounds of fuel, and our VREST is showing we can land safely with 1600 pounds of fuel, even without water. So let's contact the tower and get the QFE for La Air Base in Iran.
Springfield 1-1. Fly heading 211. Port 15. QFE 27.23. Runway 09. To pattern altitude.
So let's set 2723 on the barometric altimeter. Almost immediately we can see that the limits start to drop. That's now set, and we're now showing a dry limit of 141 pounds, and that's not safe, as the transition from normal flight to hover and landing is almost certainly going to take over 200 pounds of fuel, usually 3 to 4 times that. So we have a few options. 1, we can dump our weapons if we have any. 2, dump our water, but that's somewhat pointless. 3, activate the water and actually pump it through the engine. Or 4, go for a short rather than vertical landing. But here we're going to use water with a vertical landing. In all master modes you see a velocity vector. However, it's always caged to the aircraft azimuth, so it doesn't necessarily represent the true direction the aircraft is travelling. Only when in nav mode and where the direction of travel is more than 2 degrees off azimuth do you see the ghost velocity vector, which does represent the true aircraft direction. And here we can see that the ghost velocity vector is about 10 degrees off to the right, and this is due to crosswinds. The wind is currently 10 knots coming from 024, and as we slow down the ghost will move further and further downwind, but we should counter that by facing the aircraft more and more upwind. And ideally, when we arrive at the hover, the aircraft should be facing directly into the wind, where possible. As soon as we come out of nav mode and into VTOL mode, the ghost will disappear. You can use the yaw vane at very low speed, but mostly you'll have to rely on your eyes, and that's helped by setting up an imaginary transit line if you can. As you approach your landing spot, try to swing round the back if you have space, so you can fly straight upwind to the actual landing position, as it's much easier to fly forward a few meters than sideways. You should use your rudder to turn your nose, but you will probably need a lot of stick as well at this point.
Water, water. Water, water.
Before you touch down, remember to check your rate of descent and also that you're in a headwind. So if your IAS is 0, you'll actually be going backwards.
Water, water.
If you can't land or don't want to land vertically due to weight, altitude, fuel or whatever, you can also do short landings. There isn't a huge amount to cover here, so we're just going to cover the final approach. You should be aiming for 10 to 12 degrees angle of attack, and the nozzle should be set to roughly 60 degrees, and your descent rate should be around 200 to 400 feet per minute. Obviously, all of these will vary slightly based on weight, or if you have a very short runway to land on. As you're about to touch down, you should make sure your witch's hat is around 2 degrees above the horizon and your rate of descent is under 400 feet per minute. As ever with the Harrier, make sure that you get everything trimmed out, and here I'm not actually touching the controls at all. Keep a close eye on the flight path marker and make sure it's towards the near end of the runway. But if you're too high or too low, then you might want to add or remove throttle, pushing the flight path marker forwards and backwards until you obtain the correct glide slope. Just drifting off to the left a little bit, so I'm just going to apply a tiny little bit of rudder. Now you want to be making some final throttle adjustments to alter your landing position. If you're short, use more power and vice versa, but don't go pulling back on the stick to adjust your landing position, just use the throttle. As you're about to touch down, check your descent rate and pull back on the stick to flare if needed. That just about wraps it up for this video, so thank you for watching. The next two videos will cover the Harrier's gun and one on dogfighting. And trust me, the Harrier is way better than you imagine. Possibly the best dogfighter in DCS. So feel free to leave comments and please hit like and subscribe.